In 1932, a father of three in Chicago slipped $30 into an envelope and handed it to a man he barely knew. What he got back was not drugs, not stolen jewelry, not a forged document. It was a bottle of milk and a pound of ground beef. That was the reality of the Great Depression. By 1933, 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed. Banks had failed by the thousands. Families who once owned homes were living in cardboard shacks they called Hoovervilles, named after the president they blamed for their misery. And yet the government, in what many historians now call one of its greatest miscalculations, chose that exact moment to criminalize entire categories of everyday goods, create absurd price controls on others, and leave millions of desperate people with no legal way to feed their families. What happened next was inevitable. A massive, sprawling underground economy exploded across every city, town, and rural county in the country. People who had never broken a law in their lives became black market buyers almost overnight. And the list of what they were willing to risk arrest to obtain will genuinely shock you. Stay with me until the very end, because number 1 on this list is something almost nobody talks about anymore, and the story behind it will change how you see the entire Depression era. If you find history like this as fascinating as I do, subscribe right now so you never miss a video. Number 25 is going to surprise you already. Number 25. Bootleg alcohol. Yes, Prohibition was still technically the law until December 1933, which means that for the first 4 years of the Depression, buying a bottle of whiskey made you a criminal. But here is what most people do not realize. The repeal of Prohibition did almost nothing to kill the black market for alcohol. The legal liquor industry, once reestablished, was immediately taxed so heavily that bootleg hooch remained dramatically cheaper. In cities like Detroit, Kansas City, and New Orleans, underground distilleries and speakeasies simply kept operating after repeal, now competing on price rather than hiding from the law. Desperate men who had learned to make corn liquor during the 1920s found that their skills were suddenly a form of economic survival in the 1930s. Families brewed beer in basements and bathtubs. Moonshine operations in Appalachia ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, supplying both locals and city distributors. Federal agents estimated that by 1935, as much as 40% of all liquor consumed in the United States was still untaxed and illegal. For millions of unemployed Americans, a 10-cent jar of moonshine was cheaper than aspirin and offered the only reliable escape from a reality that had become almost unbearable. Number 24. Contraband cigarettes. The federal government imposed tobacco taxes throughout the Depression, and several states layered their own levies on top. In New York, legal cigarettes cost nearly twice what they did in Virginia or North Carolina. The result was a booming interstate smuggling trade that made certain mid-level criminals extremely wealthy. Truck drivers hauling tobacco across state lines without tax stamps became folk heroes in some communities. Buyers knew the cigarettes were hot. They bought them anyway. For a worker earning $3 a week, the difference between a legal pack and a smuggled one could mean the difference between smoking and going without. Millions chose the black market every single week. Number 23. Stolen coal. Winters during the Great Depression killed people. Home heating in the 1930s meant coal, and coal cost money that unemployed families simply did not have. Across Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and the Midwest, organized gangs of men raided coal yards at night, loaded trucks with thousands of pounds of fuel, and distributed it through informal networks at prices far below market rate. In some neighborhoods, the coal man who came around with a truck was understood by everyone to be dealing in stolen goods. Nobody cared. Children were cold. In Pittsburgh alone, police estimated that several 100,000 pounds of coal were stolen and resold every single winter of the Depression. Some of the men doing it were former coal miners who had been laid off by the very companies they were now stealing from. Number 22. Black market meat. By the early 1930s, livestock prices had collapsed so completely that farmers were slaughtering animals they could not afford to feed and leaving the carcasses to rot rather than sell at a loss. Meanwhile, in cities, families could not afford the retail price at the butcher shop. Enter the underground meat trade. Farmers who bypassed the official marketing channels and sold directly without inspection stamps, without official weight certificates, at prices well below regulated minimums, found eager buyers everywhere. In some cities, back-alley butchers operated openly, selling uninspected beef and pork to customers who came by word of mouth. Health officials estimated that tens of thousands of pounds of uninspected meat changed hands every week in major American cities alone. People knew the risks. They were more afraid of starvation than of bacterial infection. Number 21. Unpasteurized milk. This one directly ties back to the story I opened with. In the early 1930s, several states had just begun mandating pasteurization of commercial milk. The equipment required for pasteurization was expensive, which meant that compliant milk cost significantly more than raw milk sold directly by farmers. For families with young children, milk was not optional. Urban mothers formed informal networks to buy raw milk smuggled in from nearby farms in defiance of city health ordinances. The irony was profound. The regulations meant to protect children from disease were being bypassed by mothers desperate to feed those same children. Raw milk dealers operated in immigrant neighborhoods throughout New York, Chicago, and Boston, often selling out of apartments or the back of ice wagons. Some did so for years without ever being caught. Number 20. Prescription drugs sold without a prescription. The Depression-era regulatory framework around pharmaceuticals was primitive by modern standards. But it did exist, and it created a black market almost immediately. Pharmacists who were barely surviving financially began selling morphine, codeine-based cough syrups, and barbiturates directly, without requiring a doctor's visit that the customer could not afford. Traveling salesmen peddled cure-all patent medicines that contained significant quantities of alcohol, opium derivatives, or cocaine, marketed with winking wink and nod labels. In rural areas where the nearest doctor was 40 miles away and a visit cost $2 that nobody had, black market pharmaceuticals were not a luxury. They were how people managed pain, anxiety, and illness. Some of these informal networks were operated by laid-off pharmacists and even former doctors who had lost their practices. Number 19. Counterfeit food stamps and ration coupons. As various government relief programs began distributing food assistance, counterfeit documentation for those programs appeared almost immediately. In cities with large immigrant populations and established criminal networks, forged relief vouchers circulated widely. Some were produced by relatively sophisticated printing operations. Others were crude hand alterations of legitimate documents. For a family teetering on the edge of complete destitution, a forged food relief coupon that cost 50 cents and bought $5 worth of food at the government relief store was a straightforward economic calculation. The people making these forgeries ranged from professional criminals to desperate fathers with printing experience who saw a way to keep their families fed for another week. Now, pause for a second and leave a comment below telling me which one of these has shocked you the most so far. I read every single comment, and I want to know what you think. Keep watching because we are just getting started, and the items coming up are going to get a lot more surprising. Number 18. Unlicensed dentistry. By 1932, an estimated 2/3 of Americans could not afford professional dental care. Tooth infections killed people in the 1930s. Untreated abscesses spread to the jaw, to the skull, to the bloodstream. Faced with this reality, an entire underground dental economy emerged. Former dental students who had dropped out of school, former military corpsmen with medical training, and self-taught operators began pulling teeth and making crude dentures in back rooms across the country. In some cases, these were simply experienced laypeople who had watched dentists work and decided they could replicate the most common procedures. A tooth extraction that cost $5 at a licensed dentist could be had for 50 cents from an unlicensed operator. Hundreds of thousands of Americans made that choice. Most survived the experience. Some did not. Number 17. Black market gasoline. The Depression-era gasoline market was subject to both price floors set by oil companies and, in some regions, supply restrictions intended to prop up crude oil prices. The result was predictable. An entire secondary market in untaxed, unstamped fuel appeared alongside legal gas stations. In rural areas, farmers with private fuel storage tanks became informal black market gas dealers, selling to neighbors and travelers at prices below the official market. In urban areas, stolen gasoline resold through networks of corrupt gas station operators undercut legitimate prices. For a family trying to keep a truck running for a delivery job that might pay $3 a day, the difference between black market gas and legal gas could mean the difference between profit and loss. Number 16. Stolen bread and bakery goods. Bread theft was so common during the Depression that it became a social phenomenon with its own vocabulary and customs. Organized theft rings targeted bakery delivery trucks, warehouse loading docks, and grocery back entrances. The stolen bread was not primarily consumed by the thieves themselves. It was resold through informal networks at prices that undercut the legitimate market. In some neighborhoods, it was an open secret that the bread sold by certain street vendors had left a bakery without being paid for. Police in cities like Cleveland and St. Louis documented hundreds of such operations annually. In some cases, sympathetic beat officers looked the other way when the buyers were clearly destitute families rather than professional criminals. Number 15. Black market sugar. Sugar was expensive during the Depression, and it was also the primary input for both home brewing and the booming bootleg candy and confectionery trade. Wholesale sugar purchased in bulk and resold without the customary markups and taxes represented a small but consistent underground market that ran throughout the Depression era. Home brewers needed it. Bootleg candy makers needed it. Families making preserves needed it. The sugar black market was less dramatic than some others on this list, but it was enormous in scale, touching nearly every community in the country that had any significant brewing or food preservation culture. Number 14. Forged employment documents. As government relief programs began requiring proof of previous employment, residency, and financial status, a thriving market for forged documentation emerged. Men who had been drifting between states looking for work needed papers proving local residency to qualify for relief in whatever city they found themselves in. Former clerks and office workers with typewriters and access to blank official-looking forms discovered they could earn cash by producing these documents. In some cities, entire operations existed specifically to provide immigrants and migrant workers with fabricated employment histories that would qualify them for federal or state relief programs. The moral calculus for buyers was simple. Without the forged papers, they starved. With them, they might eat. Number 13. Black market currency and gold. This one is critical to understand in its historical context. In April 1933, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, making it illegal for private citizens to own gold coins, gold bullion, or gold certificates beyond a very small amount. Citizens were required to sell their gold to the Federal Reserve at the official price of $20.67 per ounce. The problem was that many Americans, particularly immigrants who had lived through European monetary crises, trusted gold infinitely more than paper money. An immediate black market for gold emerged. People hid gold coins in walls, buried them in yards, and traded them quietly through networks of trusted buyers and sellers. Jewelers, dentists, and coin dealers became informal nodes in a nationwide underground gold economy. The government prosecuted some cases, but the sheer scale of non-compliance made comprehensive enforcement essentially impossible. If this is the kind of forgotten history that you want more of, hit subscribe right now. We are going to keep going because the next several items are genuinely extraordinary. Number 12. Stolen electricity. This one will surprise people who think of the Depression primarily as a rural or unemployment story. In cities, utility shutoffs for non-payment were constant throughout the 1930s. Families whose power had been cut off began illegally reconnecting themselves to the grid through unauthorized taps. In apartment buildings, organized tenants sometimes created shared illegal connections that ran electricity to multiple units from a single metered line. Utility companies estimated that tens of thousands of illegal connections existed in major American cities at any given point during the Depression. The men who knew how to make these connections safely became informal community heroes. Some charged small fees for the service. Others did it as a form of neighborhood solidarity. Number 11. Black market medical care. For most working-class Americans during the Depression, a doctor's visit cost $2 to $5 at a time when weekly wages, for those lucky enough to have jobs, averaged perhaps $8 to $12. Hospital care was effectively out of reach for the poor. An underground medical economy emerged to fill the gap. Former nurses, retired military medics, midwives, and self-taught healers of varying degrees of competence offered services ranging from wound treatment to appendectomy-adjacent procedures in back rooms and private homes. Some of these practitioners were genuinely skilled and saved lives. Others were dangerous. Patent medicine sales exploded as people sought cheap alternatives to professional care. In immigrant communities, traditional healers operated openly in defiance of medical licensing laws that had never accounted for a population too poor to pay licensed practitioners. Number 10. Black market cigarette papers and tobacco. We touched on cigarettes earlier, but the raw materials for rolling your own deserve their own entry. Bulk, loose tobacco and rolling papers sold through informal networks, bypassing taxation entirely, represented a massive underground market that touched millions of Americans who could not afford packaged cigarettes. tobacco grown by small farmers who sold directly without going through official marketing channels undercut taxed commercial prices dramatically. In the rural South, informal tobacco trading was practically a parallel economy. Men traded it like currency. Women used it as a gift item. The quantity of untaxed loose tobacco changing hands throughout the Depression decade was, by some estimates, comparable in dollar value to the entire legal commercial cigarette market. Number 9. Stolen and resold clothing. Department store theft for resale was a structured, organized enterprise during the Depression. Gangs of shoplifters working department stores in rotating teams would systematically strip racks and counters, feeding stolen goods into fencing networks that resold them at deep discounts through second-hand stores, street markets, and apartment-based operations. But clothing theft was not exclusively a professional criminal enterprise. Desperate mothers shoplifted children's winter coats. Unemployed men stole work boots they needed to present themselves at job sites. The social stigma of theft collapsed almost entirely in some communities where survival required it. Police in major cities reported staggering increases in clothing theft throughout the early 1930s, yet conviction rates remained low because juries frequently refused to convict defendants who were visibly destitute. Number 8. Black market gasoline ration documents and government fuel permits. As various New Deal programs began regulating fuel distribution to agricultural operations and commercial enterprises, the documentation required to obtain government-allocated fuel became valuable in its own right. Forged or stolen fuel allocation permits circulated through black market networks, allowing holders to purchase fuel at regulated prices that were significantly below what the open market would have charged. Farmers who legitimately received fuel allocations they did not fully use sold their excess permits informally. The government periodically cracked down on these practices, but the sheer complexity of Depression-era regulatory machinery made comprehensive enforcement impossible. Number 7. Unlicensed barbershops. This one seems almost quaint until you understand the economics. A licensed barbershop haircut cost 15 to 25 cents during the Depression. Unlicensed operators working out of apartments, basements, and back porches charged a nickel or a dime. For a family of 4 with the father unemployed, the difference between licensed and unlicensed barbering over the course of a year represented real money. Unlicensed barbers operated in virtually every immigrant neighborhood in every major American city. Health inspectors periodically raided them. They reopened within days. In some communities, the unlicensed barber was a central social institution, functioning as an informal job posting board, a lending network, and a news exchange alongside the actual haircutting service. Let me know in the comments if you knew about any of these before watching this video. I am always curious how much of this history people already carry with them, versus how much is genuinely new. Number 6. Stolen and black market kerosene. For rural families and urban poor who had no access to the electrical grid, which in 1930 included roughly half the American population, kerosene was not a luxury. It was the difference between light and darkness, between warmth and cold. Kerosene theft and the informal resale of stolen or untaxed kerosene was widespread throughout the Depression. Delivery truck drivers systematically skimmed from their loads and resold the excess. Storage facility workers diverted inventory. Small-scale resellers operated from general stores and roadside stands, selling kerosene whose chain of custody was deliberately obscure. For buyers, the question of whether their kerosene was legitimate or stolen was entirely secondary to whether they could afford it and whether it burned. Number 5. Black market baby formula and infant food. This entry is perhaps the most emotionally brutal on the entire list, because it reflects the desperation of parents watching their infants suffer. Commercial infant formula was expensive in the 1930s, and certain infant food products were subject to price controls that created immediate shortages when supply could not meet demand at controlled prices. Informal networks of mothers shared and resold formula and infant foods outside the official retail system. In some cases, these networks were operated by pharmacists who sold directly from backstock, without going through official channels. In others, they were completely informal arrangements among neighbors. Women who had more formula than their infants needed sold their surplus to women who had less. The black market in infant nutrition was driven entirely by love and desperation, rather than profit. Number 4. Stolen medical supplies and equipment. Hospitals during the Depression were constantly underfunded and undersupplied, which created opportunity for theft. But the black market in medical supplies was not primarily a hospital theft story. It was an informal distribution economy that connected surplus supplies with people who needed them. Bandages, antiseptics, sutures, and basic surgical instruments that could not be afforded at legitimate medical prices circulated through informal networks. Former military medics who had stockpiled field medical supplies sold them quietly. Pharmacists with excess inventory sold directly without documentation. In some rural areas, the informal medical supply network was the only thing standing between farm accident victims and serious infection or worse. People who accessed these black market supplies were not making frivolous purchases. They were making survival decisions. Number 3. Counterfeit currency. The sheer scale of Depression-era counterfeiting is difficult to overstate. By the mid-1930s, the Secret Service estimated that hundreds of millions of dollars in counterfeit bills were in circulation. The counterfeiting was not exclusively the work of sophisticated criminal organizations. It included amateur efforts by desperate individuals with access to printing equipment. Printers who had lost their jobs during the economic collapse sometimes turned their skills to producing fake 10s and 20s. The quality ranged from crude and immediately detectable to sophisticated reproductions that fooled bank tellers. In some communities, certain bills were known to be almost certainly fake, yet merchants accepted them anyway, because refusing to accept any bill at all was an economic luxury they could not afford. The entire system of monetary trust that underpins commercial society was visibly fraying. Number 2. Black market apartments and housing. The Depression-era housing black market operated on several levels simultaneously. Landlords who had been pushed into informal arrangements by their own financial desperation rented space that did not meet legal habitability standards, off the books, to tenants who had no other options. Families who had been evicted but retained keys or knowledge of empty properties moved back in without authorization, sometimes with the tacit knowledge of neighbors who said nothing. In New York City, thousands of families occupied condemned buildings. In Chicago, informal basement apartments that violated every building code were rented through word-of-mouth networks for amounts that amounted to tribute payments rather than legal rent. The formal housing market had broken down so completely that the black market for shelter was, for millions of people, simply the only housing market that existed. And now we arrive at number 1. The Great Depression black market in stolen government relief itself. This is the item that I promised you would change how you see the entire Depression era, and I want to take the time to explain it properly. By 1933 and 1934, the New Deal programs had created an enormous apparatus of government relief distribution. Food baskets, cash payments, work vouchers, clothing allotments, and fuel distributions were flowing through relief agencies across the country. And almost from the moment this system began operating, a sophisticated black market in stolen and diverted government relief developed around it. It operated at every level. At the top, politically connected contractors who supplied food and goods to government relief agencies systematically overbilled, delivered inferior goods, and skimmed from contracts. In the middle, relief agency workers diverted portions of distributions to their own families or sold them for cash. At the bottom, relief recipients who received more than they needed traded excess relief goods for cash or other items outside the official system. What makes this black market so significant is what it reveals about the nature of the entire Depression-era underground economy. It was not primarily a criminal enterprise in the moral sense. It was a survival response to a formal system that had broken down beyond repair. The man who sold his government-issued food basket for cash and used the money to pay his rent was not a criminal in any meaningful moral sense. He was making a rational decision in an environment where the official rules had been written without reference to his actual circumstances. The woman who accepted a cash payment for her excess relief clothing allotment and used it to buy medicine for a sick child was navigating a system that had no mechanism for her actual needs. The Depression-era black market, in all its 25 manifestations, was not a failure of American morality. It was a testament to American ingenuity, stubbornness, and the absolute refusal to simply lie down and die when the systems that were supposed to support human life collapsed around them. Historians who have studied this period in depth consistently note that the scale of black market activity during the Great Depression was not an aberration. It was the economy. For tens of millions of Americans, the official economy had ceased to function. The black market was what remained. It was ugly, it was dangerous, it was often exploitative, and it kept people alive. The next time someone talks about the Greatest Generation as though they were some kind of morally simpler people who simply endured hardship with clean hands and pure hearts, remember these 25 items. Remember the father slipping $30 into an envelope for a bottle of milk. Remember the mother trading her food basket for rent money. Remember the children kept warm through the winter by coal stolen from the company that had fired their father. This was America during the Great Depression. Not a Norman Rockwell painting. The real thing. If this video gave you a different perspective on this era, please share it with someone who loves history. And leave a comment right now telling me which of these 25 items surprised you the most. I read every single one. I will see you in the next video.